When my daughter-in-law told me I was too outdated to attend their Christmas dinner, I nodded, drove home, and made 3 phone calls. By New Year's, their mortgage was frozen, their electricity cut, and her parents were stranded at the airport. That was only phase 1. You won't believe what came next. Hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. We read everyone. It began on a Tuesday. Cold, damp, unremarkable. Dennis Flores had just returned from the hardware store with fresh bulbs for the porch lights and cinnamon-scented candles that Maria used to love during winter. He hadn't bothered with a tree this year. The living room remained plain except for a few modest wreaths and the glow of a lamp Maria bought at a yard sale 30 years earlier. The Christmas season had become a ritual of memory more than celebration, but Dennis still kept up appearances, even if just for himself. It was while he was straightening a crooked frame in the hallway that his phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed his son's name, Michael. The kind of call that once meant dinner invites, updates on the grandkids, or simply checking in. But now, every conversation felt like a formality. He answered with a smile anyway, out of habit, out of hope. On the other end, Michael's voice was tight, apologetic in the way someone is when they aren't actually sorry. Isabella, his wife, had decided this year's Christmas dinner would be a more modern gathering, with a curated guest list. Apparently, Dennis no longer fit the aesthetic. He was told not to take it personally. It wasn't a rejection, just a redirection. There were traditions to consider, sensitivities to maintain, optics to protect. Maria wouldn't have minded, Michael assured him. It was only one dinner. Dennis didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He thanked his son and hung up quietly. Then he stood in his hallway, staring at the crooked frame, and realized something deep had shifted, something final. He didn't rage. He didn't cry. He brewed himself tea, sat in his recliner, and listened to the wind scrape against the window panes. The betrayal didn't burn, it chilled. Like the slow creep of frost under a door, it sank into his bones. For 5 years since Maria's death, Dennis had been the financial bedrock of Michael and Isabella's carefully cultivated life. The down payment on their house, the renovation of the guest suite for Isabella's parents, the monthly mortgage payments transferred with clinical consistency. Over $230,000 in 5 years. A soft-spoken donation to a relationship where his presence had quietly been demoted to nuisance. Dennis had justified it as love, as legacy, as what Maria would have wanted. But now it felt like financing his own exile. He opened the drawer in the hallway credenza and pulled out the manila folder he hadn't looked at in over a year. Inside were all the receipts, transfers, agreements, emails, apologies buried between requests. He laid them out on the kitchen table like autopsy slides. Each line of text was a needle threaded with disrespect. That night he made 3 calls. The first was to his bank. Autopay canceled. Effective immediately. The second was to a friend from his Rotary Club, an old contact at the utility company. A favor requested, a seasonal account review flagged for the Jenkins-Flores household. The third was to a travel agent. Nothing fancy. Just a round-trip itinerary to and from Spokane International Airport. Under Cody and Catherine Jenkins' names. Non-refundable. Booked with the wrong return date by accident, of course. Dennis knew they were arriving on Christmas Eve. He also knew Michael wouldn't double-check the details until it was too late. By the next morning, the gears had begun turning. Quietly. Efficiently. By the end of the week, the Jenkins-Flores mortgage went into technical delinquency. The payment had bounced, triggering a late notice and a cascade of internal flags. The utility bill, long subsidized by Dennis's generosity, now reflected 2 months of unpaid charges, an error in the automatic billing system, surely. Isabella received a polite notice about impending service suspension just as she was posting photos of her gold-rimmed dinner plates on Instagram, and the travel agency, after realizing the return flight had been scheduled for the wrong day, informed her father that rebooking would cost an additional $680 per ticket due to holiday demand. Cody Jenkins, a man who once gave Dennis a book on graceful aging as a birthday gift, would now be stuck in an airport lounge drinking vending machine coffee for 18 hours, while his perfectly curated daughter scrambled to find solutions. Dennis didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Revenge, when properly constructed, doesn't need applause. It just needs silence. He spent that Christmas Eve alone, but not lonely. A simple dinner of tamales and soup, Maria's favorite Christmas record playing softly on vinyl. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the street in the kind of peace Dennis hadn't felt in years. The phone buzzed at 7:42 p.m. Michael, then Isabella. Then Catherine. He didn't answer. He sipped his tea, adjusted the logs in the fireplace, and wrote a new list titled Debts Paid in Full. He began itemizing not just the money, but the dignity, the birthdays spent alone, the anniversaries forgotten, the silent demotions from father to financier. By midnight, the street was quiet except for the sound of wind and distant church bells. Dennis sat at his desk and opened a new document on his laptop. He titled it Accountability Ledger. It would become the backbone of a methodical unraveling, a campaign not of revenge, but of restoration. He wasn't interested in screaming at closed doors. He was interested in opening new ones with receipts in hand. This wasn't just personal. It was a reckoning. And as the fire burned lower and the snow fell thicker, Dennis Flores leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time in weeks, not because the storm had passed, but because he had finally chosen to become it. The days following Christmas were colder than usual, both in temperature and temperament. Dennis Flores didn't need to see their faces to know what kind of chaos his silence had unleashed. His phone logs told the story well enough. 18 missed calls from Michael, 6 from Isabella, 2 from her father, and a single message from Catherine that read only, "Please call us. It's urgent." He didn't. Instead, he returned to the quiet rhythm of his routines: early walks, warm coffee, daily visits to Maria's gravestone. The world, from his window, was still and white. Inside their modern, thermostatically regulated home, the Jenkins-Flores household was learning what it meant to be disconnected, not just from utilities, but from the foundation of comfort they had never truly earned. Dennis had built that foundation brick by invisible brick, and now he was dismantling it with the kind of grace only a betrayed man could wield. On December 27th, Dennis received an automated notification. The mortgage payment had been flagged again, this time triggering a hold on their escrow account. What once was a silent safety net had now become a source of concern for the couple. He had also arranged, quietly through his old buddy at the zoning board, to have their house listed for a surprise inspection, an audit of recent home business activities rumored to violate residential code. Isabella's lifestyle blog, which regularly featured paid sponsored content filmed inside their tastefully sterile kitchen, had unknowingly crossed a zoning threshold. It wasn't illegal, but it was unlicensed, and the penalties, while minor at first glance, would ripple once the city reclassified part of their property as a commercial space. Taxes, permits, disruption, all things they would now have to confront in the middle of a holiday week when most offices were conveniently closed. Dennis kept a physical binder labeled Restoration Plan on his kitchen table now. Each page contained not just actions taken, but emotional intent. This was not revenge for the sake of pain. This was balance, recalibration, a reminder that being old didn't mean being irrelevant. Being quiet didn't mean being weak. He'd spent years listening to condescending lectures about adapting to the times. They never considered that he had simply chosen not to waste his time on their noise. On December 29th, Dennis visited the local florist. He requested a bouquet be delivered to Isabella's office on January 2nd with a handwritten note. A reminder that roots are what keep things standing. You've confused surface with structure. Love, the outdated one. He smiled as he handed the note to the woman behind the counter. She didn't ask questions. Dennis had always tipped well. That same day, he contacted the title company where his name still quietly coexisted with Michael's on the property deed. He filed a clause-triggered hold for ownership clarity, invoking a 2017 provision he'd negotiated when helping them secure the property. It stated that should any co-signer's financial role in the household change without written notification, the deed could be frozen for review. It was a clause no one had expected him to remember. They would remember now. The house couldn't be refinanced, couldn't be sold, couldn't even be legally modified. Not until the hold was lifted, not until he said so. The effect wasn't immediate, but the whispers began. Neighbors asking questions. A notice posted by the HOA regarding temporary deed review status. A contractor turned away by zoning officials when they tried to start Isabella's planned sunroom extension. Delays became embarrassment. Embarrassment became tension. Tension became pressure. Dennis didn't need to see it to feel it. It was in the air, and it was only getting thicker. He mailed a package to the Jenkins-Flores address the following day. Inside was a single framed photo of Michael and Dennis on the porch of their first home together. Michael was 10. Dennis had just finished painting the railing. On the back of the frame, Dennis had taped a copy of the original mortgage document he'd co-signed for Michael and Isabella. No note, no context. Just history returned. New Year's Eve arrived like a whisper. The snow fell again, gentler now, more like a curtain being drawn. Dennis ate leftovers, drank his evening tea, and watched the clock tick toward midnight. No invitations came. No apologies. Just silence from a family that once called him the Rock. At 11:47 p.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "We really need to talk. Please." Dennis turned off his phone. At midnight, he toasted Maria's photo and opened a new tab on his laptop labeled Phase 3. It was time to take the campaign public. Quietly. Strategically. He began drafting a letter, anonymous in tone, factual in nature, to the Homeowners Association's community newsletter. It detailed certain homeowner activities and irregularities under review. It referenced bylaws. It used words like potential fraud and unreported modifications. It never named names, but it didn't need to. Everyone would know. He was careful, measured. A single drop in still water makes 1,000 ripples. By the time that newsletter reached doorsteps, the gossip would already be echoing down their manicured cul-de-sac. Dennis knew these kinds of communities. Reputation mattered more than legality. And once cracks appeared, so did questions, inspections, judgment. The same system that once excluded him would now turn on its favored residents. On January the 2nd, the bouquet was delivered. So was the audit notice, and the mortgage office sent another freeze confirmation. The pieces were now in full motion, each step an echo of the disrespect that had piled on him for years. Dennis didn't gloat. He went for his walk. He fed the birds in the park. He smiled at strangers. The only difference now was that behind that smile was a man no longer erasing himself for the comfort of others. He had become their discomfort, their overdue consequence. And as he returned home and hung his coat, the fireplace warming the shadows of a house once filled with ungrateful guests, Dennis sat at his desk and reviewed his list again. Some names were crossed out. Some were underlined. The storm he had become was only halfway through its path, and unlike the snow outside, it would not melt with time. The first ripple hit on a Thursday, unassuming, almost invisible like a whisper riding the morning frost. The community newsletter arrived folded neatly on every doorstep in that prim neighborhood where everyone knew everything and pretended not to. Inside, buried between a recipe for gluten-free banana bread and a spotlight on some 7th grader's science fair win, was the column Dennis had penned under the pseudonym Concerned Neighbor. It was surgical, no names, just implications. A call for vigilance regarding homeowners exploiting zoning loopholes, inconsistencies in property usage, and a reminder of the consequences when personal ambition supersedes community compliance. It referenced page numbers. It quoted bylaws. It bled guilt between the lines, and it landed like a bomb. By noon, Isabella's name was in whispers. By evening, her inbox was full. The very women she had hosted boozy candle-making nights with were now scheduling emergency board meetings. The HOA president, Dennis's silent partner in this slow-motion implosion, called for an anonymous town hall discussion. Not about her, of course, just a general meeting to realign expectations and prevent misuse of community privileges. Isabella panicked. Michael was already unraveling. The mortgage hold had triggered their escrow company to freeze funds set aside for property taxes, and the January payment was already late. Their lender was now demanding a full review, and their credit score had taken another hit. The contractor for their sunroom renovation backed out. Their thermostat glitched during the coldest night of the month. Their neighbors had questions, and Michael's face looked increasingly pale in every video call he had to fake his way through. Dennis, meanwhile, was silent. He spent the morning cleaning out his garage, donating a box of tools he no longer needed to a local youth program. Revenge didn't mean hoarding power. It meant knowing exactly where to place it. He walked by the lake later that day, the crunch of snow underfoot, a thermos of coffee in hand. He checked his watch. 3:17 p.m., right on time. At that moment, across town, a delivery van pulled into the Jenkins Flores driveway. 2 uniformed men stepped out, carrying a large box marked Returns. Inside was a $100 and $200 espresso machine Dennis had gifted them for their wedding. It had taken months to find it back in stock and weeks more to afford. Now it sat on their front steps, deliberately returned, though Dennis had never asked for it back. Attached was a note. Not from him. from the store confirming return status after a requested chargeback filed that week by Dennis under grounds of unauthorized beneficiary. No refund was requested, just the return, just the statement, just the wound. Isabella filmed a tearful Instagram story the next day, vaguely referencing toxic behavior from elders and boundaries being violated. It received dozens of pity comments from her curated followers. But 2 people unsubscribed. 2 brands declined to renew her content deals. Something about community reputation not aligning with brand values. Isabella called her father. Dennis already knew. He had reached out to Cody Jenkins's boss the week before, an anonymous tip highlighting unusual corporate card activity related to a recent family trip. There was nothing illegal, of course, but enough to prompt a review. Cody's position was reevaluated, his office downgraded, his bonus revoked. Back at home, Dennis updated the restoration ledger in his binder. Phase 3 was in full effect. The whispers had become voices. The discomfort had become action. Michael called again that Friday. 3 times. The voicemails began to shift from anger to desperation. "Dad, please, can we just talk? I don't know what's happening. We're falling behind. The bank's asking questions. Isabella's freaking out. We didn't mean to shut you out. It was just one holiday, come on. Can we fix this?" Dennis listened to that one twice. Then he deleted it. He didn't want to fix anything. He wanted accountability, and every call was a brick laid on the path back to it. Over the weekend, Dennis went to his storage unit. He pulled out old photo albums, birthday cards from Michael as a child, even some drawings from when Isabella first joined the family and pretended to care. He packaged them into a large box with a label, "Returned Sentiment." No note, no signature, just the box, left quietly on their porch Sunday morning. Inside, Dennis had tucked one final item, his original will, signed and dated, with Michael listed as sole heir. Scrawled across it in red ink was one line, "Voided." Enclosed was a revised copy listing his estate now assigned to the local foster youth endowment, a foundation Isabella had once dismissed at a dinner party as a little too outdated for impact. By Monday, the couple had entered panic mode. Dennis watched from a distance. He had eyes everywhere now. Neighbors, former colleagues, even the mailman who chatted with him each morning. Michael and Isabella argued in the driveway, loudly. The heating system short-cycled again. Another zoning citation arrived. The lender scheduled a physical appraisal, and the city sent a notice. Due to multiple unresolved code violations, their next property tax bracket would increase. They tried to protest. No one listened. The sympathy they might have earned had eroded beneath the surface. And still, they hadn't figured it out. Not completely. Not yet. Dennis began planning Phase 4. The first true crack in their facade did not show in their finances, but in their eyes. Dennis watched it happen one afternoon from across the coffee shop where Isabella used to film her Monday Modern Mom live streams. She sat at a corner table alone. No ring light, no curated latte art, no smile. Her laptop was open, but she wasn't typing. She was scrolling. Her fingers twitched with nervous rhythm, and every few seconds her lips pressed into a tight, artificial line, the kind people wear when trying not to scream in public. Dennis sipped his coffee 2 tables away, unnoticed. The barista knew him by name. He had tipped generously the week before and asked quietly when Isabella typically came in. Predictability was her weakness. Control had always been her illusion. And now, everything she depended on to keep up appearances was beginning to rot from the inside. She didn't know it yet, but her name had been quietly flagged on a community business grant application for misreporting home-based earnings. A concerned party, Dennis, had submitted financial screenshots from her public blog matched against the revenue reports she had claimed in a local initiative newsletter. It wouldn't lead to charges, just scrutiny, delay, and audit, enough to rattle her and put whispers in the mouths of her peers. Michael, on the other hand, had already begun to sweat visibly. Dennis had stopped hearing voicemails from him. The silence wasn't peace. It was a smothered scream, the kind of silence that grows heavy in a home and infects every word, the kind where the TV volume goes up and every room becomes a refuge from another. The mortgage office had sent its 3rd warning. The utilities inspection had triggered a meter review, forcing them into a higher tier of billing due to inconsistencies in usage patterns. Their internet speeds dropped by half for 2 days. They had argued on the phone with customer support for over an hour, only to be told there was nothing wrong on the provider's end. There wasn't. Dennis's friend on the inside had simply cued their address into a manual queue, nothing malicious, just bureaucratic purgatory. Their tech privileges had become paperweights. Dennis's lawyer had also filed a formal petition that week to have Michael removed from the deed entirely, citing breach of trust and misrepresentation of financial intent. The case wouldn't hold permanently, Dennis knew that, but it would buy time. Time for a full title review. Time for questions to arise at the county office. Time for the idea to spread in Michael's mind that he might not be the owner of the home he had posted so proudly about for years. Dennis made sure the petition details were accessible to public record. Anyone curious enough to look would see them. Especially that one neighbor Isabella hated, the one who ran the gossip newsletter disguised as a community events digest. Dennis slipped her a copy. No explanation, just a manila envelope left at her door with the word FYI in careful cursive. By midweek, the strain began to show in Isabella's social feeds. Less polish, more filters, generic captions, fewer sponsored tags. Dennis's whisper campaign was working. Brand managers talk. Once doubt enters the algorithm, partnerships dry up. Isabella's follower count began to drop, slowly at first, then with a steadier slope. She posted a reel about cutting toxic influences that ended with a blurry photo of her childhood dog and an unrelated Bible verse. Dennis watched it twice, not out of spite, but to study the tone. Desperation was a language he understood, and now they were both fluent. That Thursday, Dennis attended the HOA's monthly meeting. He sat near the back, in his old navy coat and weathered boots. Few recognized him, even fewer acknowledged him. He preferred it that way. When the floor opened for discussion about misuse of home properties, Dennis raised a hand and calmly referenced Section 4B of the Community Zoning Agreement. If a homeowner operates a business from a residential address without the appropriate declaration and receives community traffic as a result, digital or physical, it may constitute a violation. The room murmured. The board took notes. Isabella's address was not named. It didn't have to be. The next day, Michael finally reached out, not with anger, not with confusion, but with resignation. A typed email, 3 paragraphs long, apologizing for everything. For the distance, the assumptions, for not speaking up when Isabella had made her suggestion about Christmas. Dennis read it twice. It was too late. He didn't respond. Instead, he forwarded the email to his estate attorney with the subject line, "No response needed. Archive for records." Dennis spent the rest of the evening cleaning out Maria's old jewelry box. Not because he needed to, but because letting go of the things that no longer mattered gave him space to protect the legacy that still did. He found a charm bracelet Maria had started for Isabella when she first married Michael. It was half full. He placed it in a small envelope, labeled it "Unfinished Investment," and added it to the stack of symbolic returns he'd been preparing. No rage, just closure, one artifact at a time. The next morning, the Jenkins-Flores home was visited by a code enforcement officer. Anonymous complaint. Possible mold inspection required. Dennis had made no such complaint. But he knew who might. A neighbor who had found a strange puddle near their shared fence and whose patience had worn thin. Dennis had simply reminded her, last week at the market, that Isabella's home was still technically under structural review. That mold in homes with newly installed sunrooms can spread faster than expected. He had said it with concern. She had said nothing in return. But now, here we were. By the end of the week, Dennis's binder had 3 new check marks. His coffee tasted stronger. His sleep came easier. He didn't feel guilt. He felt measured, balanced. He walked slower now, not from age, but from intention. Every step forward was a step away from erasure. The world hadn't written him off. His family had. But now the ink was drying in his favor, and the title on the last page of his binder, newly added in bold pen, read Phase 5, Public Silence, Private Collapse. By the first week of January, the Jenkins-Flores home began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated pressure chamber. The cracks Dennis had seeded were no longer silent. They were screaming. Calls from their lender became daily. The second mortgage payment had officially lapsed, which triggered a 30-day default clock. Isabella's parents, who had returned from their holiday flight delay with more complaints than apologies, were beginning to question whether their modern power couple of a daughter and son-in-law had ever truly had things under control. Cody Jenkins' demotion at work had begun to affect his confidence at home, and he had snapped at Isabella twice in front of the kids. The tension in the air, once subtle, now grew loud and visible. Chipped voices, long silences, doors closing a little too hard. Dennis knew because the HOA security logs were quietly forwarded to him by a trusted ally on the board. Unusual comings and goings, a visit from a financial advisor, a contractor who showed up, but left 15 minutes later after a hushed conversation on the porch. All of it recorded. All of it fed into the narrative Dennis had constructed. One of elegant, plausible collapse. Meanwhile, Dennis had escalated the campaign into something far more insidious. He no longer needed to act directly. The community had begun doing it for him. Rumors swirled about tax problems, unpaid permits, failed inspections. The story had changed. It was no longer Isabella and Michael, the golden couple with the influencer house. Now it was that couple, the ones under review, the ones hiding something. And Isabella, for all her carefully curated charm, had never built real relationships, only audiences. And audiences turn fast, especially when there is blood in the algorithm. Dennis didn't need to say a word. He spent those days rereading old letters Maria had written to him from their early years. He organized the pantry. He called his goddaughter and offered to help pay for her nursing degree. Quiet gestures. Soft power. Control did not have to look loud. It just had to be firm. But the real masterstroke came when Dennis contacted the property insurance company. A forgotten clause in the policy, one that Dennis had negotiated at signing, required all financial contributors to the property be notified before any coverage changes. Dennis submitted a hold on policy adjustments due to undisclosed third-party occupancy. This triggered a temporary freeze, which meant no renovations, no repairs, and the moment of poetic justice came when a pipe burst in the Jenkins Flores kitchen during an unusually cold night, one of the few that week where the automated heating system had failed to cycle properly, due to the tiered conservation audit Dennis's friend had initiated. Water damage, warped floorboards, and no insurance funds available to cover immediate repair. Michael's email that week was less composed. It was a storm of confusion, half threats, half begging. He accused Dennis of sabotaging his life, ruining their credit, interfering with their privacy. But there was no proof, no smoking gun, only a string of coincidences they could not publicly attribute. Dennis did not respond. He simply added the email to his binder under emotional volatility. Confirmed. Isabella, stripped of partnerships and now facing community sanctions, attempted to pivot her content. She began posting minimalist videos about decluttering your life, hinting vaguely at betrayal, at boundaries, at outgrowing toxic roots. It backfired. Comments turned mocking. Screenshots circulated in private group chats Dennis had never seen but knew existed. One of the brands she had worked with publicly distanced itself from her after values misalignment. A once rising influencer now found herself being quietly pushed off the algorithm cliff. And then Dennis delivered his next piece of theater. A small dinner invitation, handwritten, addressed to Michael, Isabella, Cody, and Catherine, delivered via registered mail. It read, "You are cordially invited to a private dinner on February 1st to discuss restoration, reconciliation, and financial clarity. Location, 14 East Marrow Drive, the original Flores residence. Attire formal. Tone honest. RSVP not required. Attendance expected." He sent one copy to each of them. No explanation. No signature. But they would know. It was the same house they had left behind. The house Maria had filled with warmth, and which Dennis had kept up even after being relegated to holiday irrelevance. He cleaned it for the occasion, set the table with Maria's best china, even left an extra chair open, not out of sentiment, but to remind them what had been taken. February 1st arrived. The doorbell rang, and Dennis, dressed in his charcoal suit and a red tie Maria had given him for their 23rd anniversary, opened the door, but not a single one of them showed. Up only a process server, delivering an official request from Michael, seeking to reclaim full title rights to the house. Dennis signed the form and smiled because the next phase had already begun. The morning after the dinner that never was, Dennis awoke not with bitterness but with focus. He folded the cloth napkins, packed away the untouched roast, and swept the porch of the leaves that had gathered under the feet of no guests. There was no mess to clean because none of them had shown up. Not Michael, not Isabella, not her smug parents. Only a man in a windbreaker holding an envelope stamped with urgency. That envelope now sat on Dennis's mantel. He had signed the request for a title transfer out of pure courtesy, not agreement, and certainly not defeat. He had already anticipated this move weeks ago. It was phase 6 of his ledger, petty authority grab. It marked the precise moment the punished tried to reclaim control through paperwork and tantrums. Dennis didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it, because when someone takes legal action without understanding the architecture of their own dependency, they usually open a door they cannot close. Michael's request sought to reclaim full ownership of the home, asserting that Dennis had relinquished financial support and thus rights. But what Michael didn't know, or had failed to remember, was that the original agreement had included a survivorship clause, drafted under Maria's name and maintained even after her death. That clause made Dennis's signature the required linchpin for any legal adjustments to the title or refinance plans. He was still, by contract and by the county registry, the anchor of the deed, and that meant Michael's request was invalid unless Dennis consented. He wouldn't, not now, not ever. That week, Dennis submitted an official objection through his lawyer, not just to deny the request, but to challenge Michael's legal standing based on financial misrepresentation and moral breach. Included were records of the unpaid mortgage months, the citations from the HOA, and even a printed copy of Isabella's now archived blog post titled Elderly Entitlement: When to Cut Ties. He didn't need to explain it. The judge would read between the lines. The case would drag, publicly. The stain wouldn't be just on their credit but on their name. It would surface on background checks. It would become searchable. Dennis had turned their grasp for control into their own unraveling. At the same time, Dennis sent another package, this time to the HOA board. Enclosed were documents, proving that multiple zoning violations tied to Isabella's digital brand had been active since 2021. He included an anonymous community poll assembled by a friend on the board that showed over 60% of residents believed the Jenkins Flores home was an ongoing nuisance or compliance risk. It was the kind of data that couldn't be ignored, and it triggered a mandatory review by the board, leading to a temporary community status freeze. They were now ineligible to vote on neighborhood issues, use the clubhouse, or attend board-hosted events. For someone like Isabella, that was exile. Meanwhile, Dennis's next act was poetic in its simplicity. He uploaded a YouTube video, not under his name, but under the channel of a local history group he had supported for years. The video was titled Roots and Foundations: The Forgotten Architects of Merrow Hills. In it, Dennis narrated the story of how the neighborhood was founded, who helped write the first bylaws, who donated land, and who financed the early infrastructure. His name came up multiple times, with receipts, photos, signatures, a legacy they had erased, now immortalized in digital record. The video gained quiet traction. Neighbors shared it. Some commented. Isabella's followers, those who still lingered, stumbled upon it. The contrast was jarring. One comment read, "Wait, her FIL built the neighborhood she's trashing?" Dennis didn't reply. He didn't need to. Then came the tax audit. Dennis hadn't initiated it directly, but he had whispered the right details to the right accountant at the Community Foundation Board. Numbers that didn't add up in the Jenkins Flores Community Donations Report. A simple discrepancy, a missed deduction, and suddenly, a trigger was pulled. The IRS opened a file. Letters arrived. Appointments were scheduled. Michael tried to manage it, but his job had recently changed. He was being repositioned, not fired, not demoted, just moved sideways into a department that didn't exist 3 years ago. They called it restructuring. Dennis called it karma. Through all of this, Dennis never raised his voice. He never posted online. He didn't even talk about it to his friends at the senior center. His vengeance wasn't for applause. It was for precision. And now, Michael and Isabella were standing on a platform with no support beams, realizing too late that the man they had mocked for being outdated was the very foundation they had built their lives on. And foundations don't forget. One afternoon, Dennis walked into the community bank. He smiled at the teller, made a polite deposit, and then requested a meeting with the branch manager. He asked that a letter be notarized, confirming his ongoing financial interest in the Jenkins Flores property and his current role as co-signer. Nothing illegal, just a paper trail. And when that letter was added to the public deed record, it would become one more knot Michael couldn't untie. Dennis then visited the post office and sent one more box. No return address, no note. Just an old photo album with family pictures from the years when they still came to Christmas. Sticky pages, faded ink, childhood laughter frozen in time. At the end of the album, a final image. Maria in front of the fireplace, holding a stocking with Dennis's name on it. The caption read, "For the man who holds it all together." Underneath the album, Dennis tucked a single key, a copy of the front door to his house. Not their house, his house, where they used to be welcome, where they no longer belonged, and on the back of the box, in sharp black ink, Dennis wrote, "Outdated doesn't mean outmatched." By mid-February, the weather outside had begun to soften, but inside the Jenkins-Flores household, the frost had only deepened. The house that once buzzed with curated chaos, chic brunches, photo shoots, kid-approved snack platters, had become a cold chamber of unspoken truths and half-answered questions. The utilities were back on for now, but with payment warnings hanging like storm clouds over their heads. The mortgage was still locked in dispute. The deed request had stalled, and the property title was now under formal review, pending Dennis's notarized interest. The house was no longer theirs in confidence. It was a shared battleground of paper, silence, and slow, sanctioned vengeance. But it wasn't the financials that broke them. It was the mirror Dennis held to their identities. Isabella's influence empire, already cracked, began hemorrhaging after a clip from the Roots and Foundations video surfaced on a viral TikTok. A teenager, unaware of the full story, had stitched the clip over an old promotional video Isabella had posted a year earlier. The contrast was damning. Dennis talking about building the neighborhood from scratch, then Isabella boasting about her self-made lifestyle. The comments lit up. Wait, her FIL did all the real work? So she married money and forgot where it came from? This is why boomers don't trust millennials. It snowballed. Sponsors didn't call back. 2 more brands removed her from affiliate programs. She posted an apology video with soft piano music and a vague reference to family complications. But the internet smelled weakness. Her once loyal audience began to peel away, and with them went her last illusion of control. Michael, meanwhile, found his world shrinking. His job had shifted him to a remote compliance role, which translated into silence and irrelevance. He went from leading Zoom meetings to taking notes in them, from approving budgets to reviewing invoices. His coworkers no longer replied to his casual messages. Even his supervisor, once an ally, now kept things short and formal. The title of project lead was gone. His name stopped appearing in the monthly newsletter. He was still being paid, but barely noticed, and that hurt more than a demotion. It was an invisible erasure, the kind Dennis had lived through every Christmas after Maria passed. Dennis saw all of it unfold from a distance, not because he was obsessed, but because he knew how slowly neglected bridges collapse. First the strain, then the cracks, then one final, graceful fall. He had become the architect of their unraveling, but he wasn't pushing anymore. Now gravity was doing the work. Still, he added touches. He donated a large sum to the Community Scholarship Fund in Maria's name, anonymously. The local paper ran a thank you note and mentioned the family by name. Not Michael's, just Maria and Dennis Flores. The article read, "Founders and legacy residents give back to the neighborhood that they helped build." Isabella's father, Cody, saw it. He forwarded it to his daughter with one word, interesting. That same week, Cody submitted a petition to have his name removed from a trust Isabella had created. Quietly, legally, cleanly. Dennis heard about it from the same attorney both men once shared. No comment was needed. The walls were closing in, but Dennis wasn't finished. He scheduled a public estate planning seminar at the local community center. Not flashy, just a fiscally sound living for seniors workshop. Flyers were posted, invitations sent. One flyer was taped to the mailbox at the Jenkins-Flores house, not as a threat, but as a reminder. The event was well attended. Dennis walked them through living wills, medical directives, and, most importantly, asset preservation from irresponsible beneficiaries. He didn't mention names, but every example was tailored, crafted from the same template Michael and Isabella had followed like scripture. The audience murmured with recognition. Several attendees asked for copies of the sample documents. The seed had been planted. That night, Dennis received a voicemail, not from Michael, but from Isabella. Her voice was trembling, not with sadness, but anger. She accused him of destroying their life, of turning the community against them, of humiliating her in ways that could never be undone. Dennis listened to every word, then played it again, not to gloat, but to measure. There was no apology, no reflection, only a wounded ego trying to retake ground it never owned. He didn't respond. Instead, he made a note in his binder. Phase 7. Control shifts publicly. To make the point land, He prepared one more gift. He found a photo of the first Christmas after Maria died, the last one where Michael and Isabella had come willingly. In it, Dennis stood at the head of the table, Michael at his side, Isabella in the corner already looking at her phone. He had it printed, framed, and delivered to their house through the same courier that had once delivered their wedding registry gifts. The photo arrived wrapped in crisp brown paper, tied with black ribbon. No note, just the image, frozen in time, where respect still existed, where Dennis still belonged. They didn't respond, but the silence was louder than any scream. The first week of March began with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a small, dignified affair held at the east entrance of Merrow Hills, where the old stone path had been restored and a new bronze plaque installed. It read, "In recognition of Dennis and Maria Flores, original stakeholders and founders of East Merrow Hills." The words weren't chosen by Dennis, but by the community committee he had once chaired decades ago, now reassembled and re-energized thanks to a quiet donor who had promised matching funds for civic projects. That donor was Dennis, of course. He stood off to the side during the ceremony, dressed simply, smiling faintly, not needing applause. He didn't wave. He didn't give a speech. He just stood there while photos were taken. Photos that would appear in both the HOA newsletter and the local newspaper. In every image, Dennis stood tall. And in the background, the Jenkins Flores residence appeared like a ghost, visible, yet wholly absent. The article that followed included a brief paragraph listing the Flores family's original contributions to the neighborhood. There was no mention of Michael, no mention of Isabella. In a twist of poetic justice, the same publication that had once done a glowing spotlight on Isabella's modern homemaking movement had now given more space to a man they'd all written off as old news. Reputation was currency, and Dennis had just bought back every ounce of what they stole. But that was just the beginning. The next Monday, Dennis sent one final letter, not through a lawyer, not through an agency, but handwritten. It arrived in a plain envelope, slid beneath the door of the Jenkins Flores home by a courier dressed like any other delivery man. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 lines written in elegant, deliberate cursive, "Legacy is earned, not assumed. Your debt to me is no longer financial. It is historical, and history has a long memory." There was no signature, just the faint imprint of the Flores family crest, embossed in the corner, something Isabella wouldn't recognize, but Michael would. It was from their family Bible, a relic Maria had always kept in the glass cabinet by the dining room. Dennis had taken it out just once to press that stamp, an echo from the past that whispered louder than any threat. That same week, the local community archive launched an online exhibit featuring interviews from Merrow Hills founders. Dennis had participated in several of them, soft-spoken detailed recollections of zoning meetings, contractor disputes, landscaping plans, and neighborhood disputes, all stories Michael and Isabella had never cared to ask about, let alone preserve. But now, they were being cataloged, preserved, and featured on the community homepage that Isabella used to control through her sponsorship contacts. The board had quietly removed her access weeks ago, citing her ongoing litigation and reputational instability. She hadn't been told until she tried to log in and found her credentials revoked. Dennis didn't need to know the details. He only had to listen to the silence. The garage door no longer opened at predictable hours. The lights inside their home were erratic, on at odd times, off during the day, sometimes flickering. Their decorative porch sign, once boasting "Welcome to the Jenkins Flores Modern Farmhouse," was gone. In its place, an empty hook and a crack in the siding where someone had removed it hastily. Dennis walked by often, not to gloat, to confirm. He noticed the deliveries were fewer now. No floral arrangements, no branded meal kits, no oversized Amazon boxes with influencer tools, only municipal notices and certified envelopes. Meanwhile, Dennis bought flowers every Tuesday, yellow tulips, Maria's favorite. He placed them at her gravestone without fail, each time accompanied by a single folded copy of the latest printout from the community bulletin, where his name continued to surface as a long-standing steward of Merrow Hills. Legacy, it seemed, was being rewritten, truthfully this time. But the final stroke wasn't public. It was personal. Dennis called the estate attorney one last time, not to update his will, but to finalize the removal of Michael as executor. He appointed a goddaughter instead, one who had visited every Christmas for the last 6 years, even when Michael had not. Her name would now be tied to the Flores Trust. She would inherit not just the assets but the story. Dennis prepared a letter for her too, with instructions not to open it until after his passing. Inside were photos, deeds, and a written history of how he had dismantled the myth his son and daughter-in-law had built on borrowed foundations. It wasn't spite. It was preservation. Then he boxed up the last few remnants of their betrayal. The final HOA letters, the printed Instagram posts, the apology video Isabella had deleted but which Dennis had saved offline. He sealed them in a file folder labeled Arrogance, Archived. Then he slid it into the back of his filing cabinet and locked the drawer. That night, he received one more call. It was Michael. The voice on the other end didn't ask for anything. It simply said, "I didn't know it would go this far." Dennis paused before replying. "It never had to. But you both chose distance over memory. And memory has a price." Michael didn't respond. The line went dead, and Dennis, alone but never lonely, marked the end of Phase 8 with the final entry in his ledger. "They buried me with distance. I returned the favor with history." The final unraveling didn't come as a single collapse. It came in layers, thin, suffocating quiet. By mid-March, the Jenkins Flores house no longer felt like a home. It resembled a hollow showroom of regrets, a place where light once entered easily and laughter echoed off the walls. Now the curtains stayed drawn. The porch was bare. The only sound that remained was the dull rhythm of failure ticking behind their walls. Dennis walked past it often, not with malice, but with certainty. He didn't need to press any further. The foundation had eroded completely. His presence now was simply punctuation, a calm, deliberate reminder that history has gravity, and he had long since taken control of the weight. Isabella had become a ghost online. Her last post, over a month old, was still pinned to the top of her now dormant page, an apology wrapped in victimhood, fingers pointed at unnamed elderly manipulation and deep family wounds. But the comments had turned. Even her most loyal followers had grown skeptical, then bored. She had built her platform on aspiration, and now every trace of struggle shattered that illusion. A few clickbait blogs tried to spin the narrative. When boomer parents sabotaged success, but it didn't land. There was no villain to spotlight, no quotes to amplify. Dennis had remained silent, methodical, invisible to headlines. And because of that, the narrative collapsed under its own weight. Michael, meanwhile, had entered the quiet desperation phase. His email signature no longer held a title, just Michael Flores with a generic phone number and no corporate address. He had become professionally adrift, shuttled into remote oversight roles with no upward track. His team had been restructured out from under him, projects reassigned. His once decorated LinkedIn profile had gone dark. Dennis had never lifted a finger against his career directly. But consequence doesn't always need targeting. It only needs inertia. The same financial disputes tied to the deed review had made Michael ineligible for internal promotions. His bank had flagged their joint financial status, and the whisper of a pending legal investigation, even unfounded, was enough to cool off HR departments faster than a winter gust. The home they fought to secure had become an anchor. The mortgage, still frozen in escrow dispute, could not be sold or refinanced. Contractors wouldn't touch it without full insurance clearance. Their last attempt to rent out the guest suite was denied by the HOA. Dennis had submitted a formal concern about transient leasing, citing neighborhood stability and safety. It passed with a narrow vote. One of the board members had nodded to Dennis after the meeting, not out of loyalty, but respect, the kind earned when you remind a community who first poured its cement. Dennis's power wasn't in what he did anymore. It was in what he represented. He had become a living reminder of their entitlement, of every bridge they had torched under the illusion that he would never build another. But Dennis had built everything from the ground up once before, and now, piece by piece, he was doing it again. Not for himself, but to ensure they never could. His mailbox overflowed less these days. Most of the correspondence had stopped. No more legal letters. No more frantic calls. Michael hadn't left a voicemail in over 2 weeks. Isabella had unfollowed him online. Not that he ever noticed. He didn't exist in their feeds. He existed in the records, in the foundations, in every legal block they now faced when trying to undo what had been done. One afternoon, Dennis received a padded envelope. No return address. Inside was a single item, the charm bracelet Maria had started for Isabella. Half full, tarnished, no note. just a silent concession that even sentiment could no longer bridge the chasm. He placed it back in its original box, added it to the archived arrogance file, and slid it to the back of his drawer without expression. The victory wasn't in receiving it. The victory was that they had realized it no longer held value. That weekend, Dennis attended a local fundraiser for the senior library. His name was announced among the top donors. He didn't wave, just nodded and left early, stopping by the lake Maria loved before heading home. He watched the water move under gray skies, remembering the softness of her voice when she used to describe how peace wasn't found in stillness, but in control of the current. That was what this entire war had been about. Not rage, not vengeance, not legacy. Control. They had tried to wrest it from him using trends and shallow insults, tried to define him as outdated, irrelevant, disposable, and he had answered, not with anger, but with order, with the kind of structured, deliberate retaliation that leaves no debris, only silence. Later that night, Dennis received an email, a single line, from Michael. "Is it really over?" Dennis closed the screen. He did not reply. He would never reply. The ledger stayed open on his desk, only one page left blank. Spring came to Merrow Hills with early blossoms and quiet apologies. The birds returned before the people did. The sidewalks were swept, the community newsletter released its quarterly issue, and Dennis Flores found his name printed on the cover, this time beneath the words, "Lifetime Stewardship Recognition." The honor was simple, yet complete. A nod from a town that had tried to forget him, only to be reminded, in the most meticulous way, of exactly who built the ground beneath them. He didn't attend the award ceremony. He didn't need to. His name was carved into the new marble bench installed by the lake. The same lake Maria had loved. The same one where Dennis now went every Thursday with a thermos of tea and a folded newspaper. The bench said, "For those who remember when things were made to last." No surname, but everyone in the neighborhood knew. Meanwhile, across the cul-de-sac, the Jenkins-Flores home had grown still. No new vehicles. No more party lights. The landscaping had started to falter. Shrubs untrimmed, the porch unswept, a single gutter hanging slightly loose over the garage. Isabella had ceased posting entirely. Michael's LinkedIn remained untouched since January. They had become background characters in the very story they once tried to dominate. Ghosts in their own home, locked in a space that had turned from canvas to cage. The mortgage remained under legal dispute. The property title still shared. The escrow account in freeze. The homeowner association continued its oversight, and their voting rights had not been restored. Their social standing had vanished. The isolation was complete. But Dennis had one last move. He made it on a Monday. He called the Community Preservation Committee, the same one that had honored him, and requested to sponsor a new program, the Flores Initiative for Community Legacy, a quarterly grant funded directly from the trust he had restructured to support families in need of emergency home repair, elder care, or funeral expenses. The conditions were clear. No relatives, no inheritance claims, just neighbors helping neighbors, in Maria's name. That same week, he contacted a local historian who was assembling a digital archive of Merrow Hills' founding families. Dennis offered full access to his documents, blueprints, letters, photos. In exchange, he asked only that the exhibit be titled Foundations, the Builders Beneath the Surface. They agreed. The archive launched online to quiet fanfare but high engagement. Within weeks, local high schools were referencing it in civic studies projects. Teachers quoted him. Young residents shared stories about the guy who built everything and got erased. Dennis didn't smile when he saw it. He just nodded once, slowly, and then he filed the final motion. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. A single-page filing with the county clerk's office, officially revoking his power of attorney rights over the Jenkins-Flores estate. He included a statement that read, "All decisions regarding this property and its financial standing are henceforth entirely theirs."
As requested.
As deserved, it was a release, not of responsibility, but of leverage. They could not beg for help now. They could not argue over control. The house, the loans, the taxes, the mess. It was all theirs again, untethered, unsupported, and utterly unsalvageable. Later that day, a package arrived at the Jenkins-Flores doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single blank house key. Attached to it was a square of old newspaper, The real estate ad from 15 years ago announcing the sale of the house, circled in faded ink. On the back, a handwritten note. This is the last thing I ever wanted back. I leave it to you, not out of forgiveness, but closure. Lock the door behind you when it all ends. Or don't. It's not my concern anymore. Isabella didn't post about it. Michael didn't reply. They had no cards left to play, no statements left to craft, no audience to plead with. Dennis spent that night at Maria's grave. He brought a candle this time, let it flicker until the sky turned dark and the chill settled in. He sat quietly and whispered things no one else would hear, not out of sentiment, but out of reverence. For the woman who had believed in him before anyone tried to forget, he mattered. As he rose, he didn't look back. He walked home, placed the final volume of his ledger on the shelf, and poured himself a glass of tea. The last page was already filled. Justice is not loud. It is slow. It is deliberate. And it lasts longer than anyone expects. If this story hit you like a quiet storm, let it linger. Like if you've ever been underestimated. Share with someone who knows that silence is power. Subscribe for more stories where justice doesn't shout. It calculates. And tell us in the comments, which part of Dennis's revenge hit the hardest for you?